And I think, Jim, you've actually said that this inflation is going to turn to deflation faster than most people realize. Can you explain what that means and then what that looks like and then maybe the ramifications of that?
Sure, that is my view. I'm happy to explain it. And it catches a lot of people by surprise. They're like, wait a second, Jim, it's inflation. You just look at 2022, starting in January, it was kind of like 7%. Then it was, oh, it's 8.1, it's 8.6, now it's 9.1, which is true. That is the year. It is going up. So people extrapolate that. And again, there is this comparison to the 70s. By the way, I think the situation we're in today is very different from the 1970s, and I'll explain why. But well, I'll explain why right now. Because in the 70s, it was triggered from the supply side with first the Arab oil embargo in 1973 as a result of the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, and then the price tripled, but it went from like $2 to $6. Okay. But percentage terms, that's a huge jump, but it was still $6. And then it got to 12. And then in 1979, you had a second oil embargo because of Iran and the Ayatollah and the revolution and the hostages and all that. And then it went from kind of 12 to 20. So oil went up by a factor of 10 in the course of the late 70s because there's two different embargoes. So that's coming from the supply side. But what happened was, the other source of inflation is on the demand side. So you have what's called cost push inflation. That's where supplies choked off, or there's an embargo, or there's a shortage, natural disaster, a lot of things. It's coming from the supply side, and demand is inelastic, so you just pay up or kind of do without. But the demand side is much more psychological. That's called demand pull inflation. That's when consumers behave the way I described. And as I say, I lived through the 70s, where, hey, I better buy it today, I better buy it now. You're pulling all this demand forward and bidding up prices because you're worried that it's going to get even worse. So as that applies to today, we are starting with the cost push inflation, mainly the price of energy, but the price of food is a big factor. And of course, they're related. It's like, here's the energy, here's the food. Where do you think the food comes from? To get the food, you got to feed the pigs and cows. What do you feed them? You feed them corn. How do you get corn? Well, you grow it on a farm. You need nitrogen fertilizer. You need diesel in your tractors. You get the food. You got to put it in a truck to get it from point A to point B. That requires diesel. The higher the diesel price, the higher the cost of food because you're moving it by truck, et cetera. So these things, as I say, are linked. But food prices are going up substantially, and the two things you can't do without are gas in the car and food. So you have that cost push inflation. We're not quite at the stage where it's demand pull. We're not quite at the stage where individual consumers are behaving the way I described in the 1970s, saying, "Hey, better spend the money fast because it's losing value," and you see that in inflationary expectations and inverted yield curves. And I'll come back to that because that's a really big deal. If you thought inflation was going to run away, as it did in the 70s, yield curves would be steeply sloping, and people would be in a frenzy to buy stuff. They're not. And the yield curves are not sloping or upward sloping. They're inverted. They're going down. That tells you that, and we also see this in inflationary expectations. Inflationary expectations don't drive inflation here and now. What does is inflation here and now can feed on itself. Inflationary expectations don't drive it, but they tell you a lot. They're information rich. They tell you a lot about what people expect. What the yield curve is telling us, what inflationary expectations are telling us, and other factors are telling us is that, yeah, there's inflation now, but the Fed's going to kill it, and they're going to kill it by destroying demand and throwing us into a recession. And here's where it gets interesting, because you could flip from this kind of inflation to disinflation or even deflation very quickly. And people are definitely not prepared for that. Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Kind of everyday consumers are prepared for it. I'm not sure Wall Street and mainstream economists and policymakers are prepared for it. They're just extrapolating the inflation, saying, well, the Fed's going to kill it. Yeah, they might kill it, but at a price, at a very steep price. And consumers are really bracing for that. So, even Jay Powell said the soft landing is a myth. There's not going to be a soft landing. It's going to be a hard landing, but that's not priced into markets. The markets are kind of pricing in a squishy landing or a soft landing or from the runways. They're not pricing in a really hard landing, and that is what we're going to get.
Wow, it's going to be interesting to watch. And yeah, no one's talking about deflation, so that will be an interesting potential end to this. You talked also about an emerging global liquidity crisis, and maybe you could explain what that is. Obviously, last time you were here in London, Jim, you and I spoke about, you know, the long-term capital management crisis of '98, where there was a real liquidity issue, and I think you guys had $1.7 trillion worth of derivatives at the time, and then we saw that happen again in '08. Well, first of all, maybe tell people, what is it like to go through a liquidity crisis? People don't realize how bad things were in '98 or even in '08. And then what would one look like now?
They kind of all look the same. I mean, they pop up in different places. You know, in 1998, it was long-term capital management. The sequence there was interesting because that crisis actually started in June 1997 in Thailand, when there had been a huge capital inflows at a fixed exchange rate. And Thailand said, sorry, we're going to devalue the baht. And everyone said, oh, gee, I borrowed dollars and invested in Thai assets. Now they're worth half. Get me out of here. They dumped everything. And then that spread to Malaysia. I happened to be pretty well acquainted with Dr. Mahathir, who was prime minister at the time. He has some interesting stories to tell about that. Then Indonesia, then South Korea by the fall of 1997. And, you know, the old expression, you know, buy when there's blood in the streets. Well, sadly, there was real blood in the streets in Korea. There were riots and people were killed. And then it cooled off a little bit. And then up pops Russia, you know, by April. And then that came to a head in August of 1998. And the whole world was waiting for Brazil. Brazil was the next domino. Like I said, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, Russia. Here comes Brazil. No, here comes long-term capital management. We were we were like a country in terms of size and leverage and all that. And that became the epicenter of the crisis. And of course, I negotiated that bailout, so I had a pretty front row seat. You know, my wife remembers I was getting, if I got any sleep, a lot of people didn't sleep for 5 days, but I said, I got to get at least 2 hours in here because I got to make decisions. And one night I went to bed at 1 o'clock and I was going to get up at 5, but at 3 o'clock, the phone rang. And it was the Italian finance ministry. They were looking for some information on some unsecured loan agreement they happened to be in. We were the biggest holder of Italian government debt. So I took the call, and then she said, well, when you were done, you went right back to sleep. It took you 2 seconds to fall asleep. So that's how crazy it was.
The greedy bankers are about to do it again. In 2008, they crashed our financial system and nearly bankrupted the entire global economy. Then they received trillions of dollars in government bailouts. And after, they demanded fat bonuses paid for by you, the taxpayer.
It turns out the banks haven't just been screwing the American taxpayers, they're also screwing over their investors. Turns out the banking industry is the worst place you could put your money, despite enormous taxpayer bailouts.
Now the bankers are back to take away your financial freedom. They lie and tell you that cryptocurrency isn't safe. They try to make it illegal for you to choose how to invest your hard-earned money. They lie and say cryptocurrency is used by money launderers and criminals. But look at the record. It's the banks themselves that launder hundreds of billions of dollars every year to the biggest criminal operations in the world.
Leaked documents have revealed how some UK banks have helped criminals, money launderers and Russians under sanctions.
American authorities discovered that the Sinaloa cartel moved $881 million through HSBC accounts as bank officials turned a blind eye to the illegality.
The bankers lie and say cryptocurrency is not a real investment. Meanwhile, the smartest CEOs in the world are buying billions and billions of it. The truth is that banks lie about cryptocurrency because it makes them scared. The banks take $9 trillion per year of your hard-earned money, and they are worried that they will finally be exposed. They're scared because crypto means they can no longer control your money, which means they can no longer control you. They are scared because you might actually understand your money and intelligently decide what to do with it. Now is the time for us to come together, fight back, and take control. It's time to educate ourselves, our families, and our communities. Because financial education means financial freedom. We know that cryptocurrencies will help us build the new, decentralized financial system of the future. A banking system that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. A banking system where access to finance is a fundamental human right. A banking system that is free and fair and welcomes all humans on this earth. The DeFi revolution is happening. We, the people, can no longer be fooled. We choose to take control of our finances. We choose to take control of our freedom. We choose to take control of our future. Join us, and let's take back our financial freedom forever.